Now here in the studio is Peter Kuznick. He is a professor of history at American University, and for a German perspective, we're joined by Mark Huer in Berlin. He is the Washington bureau chief for Der Spiegel, and from Moscow joining us is Dmitry Babic. He is a political analyst for Voice of Russia Radio. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you to the studio. Professor Kuznick, let me start with you. It was the world's deadliest conflict. More than 30 nations involved, 50 million people killed. Was it avoidable or was it just inevitable?
It was avoidable. I mean, we have to trace the origins really back to the solution after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles, which didn't really settle any of the issues that had surfaced before that. But even as late as the 1930s, there were steps that could be taken. Germany was arming and clearly expansion-minded. Hitler laid out a strategy in Mein Kampf for moving against the Soviet Union. The Russians understood that. The Soviets understood that. They tried to get international collective self-defense in order to stop Hitler, but the West wasn't interested. The Soviets actually joined the League of Nations in 1934 in order to build up international opposition to Hitler and Hitler's expansionist policies. Then in October of 1935, we have Italy invading Ethiopia. Soon thereafter, the Spanish Civil War breaks out. It was Germany and Italy backing the fascist forces in Spain. The Soviets were on the other side, supporting the elected government, the Republican forces, but the United States remained neutral. And Churchill actually supported the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. So through the mid-30s, there was still a chance to stop Hitler, and Hitler knew that. When Hitler moved into the Rhineland, he said if the French had come in there and resisted, he would have gone running out of there, he said, with his tail between his legs. So there was a lot of chance, but the world just did not stand up to the fascist forces or to the aggressive forces in Japan.
Okay, let's go to Mark in Germany. And Mark, you have Germany at the heart of two world wars in the last century. Now, 75 years on since the start of World War II, how does Germany deal with this history?
Well, I think we lived for 70 years now with this historic guilt, and I think it determined German politics over this period of time, and still does today. I think we were, and we still are, very aware of this historic guilt, and we in the first decades after the war, we tried to be as silent as possible. So we tried not to participate and be an actor, but being a good citizen of the Western Hemisphere. And now it changed over time, and we still see now we are at a turning point where Germany's importance as a nation, economically as well as politically, within the European Union grew substantially, and there is this new demand of German leadership within the European Union. And we're still struggling what we've learned over the decades, that we don't have to be an active part of world crisis, but we now are, because of our importance, forced to participate and take a position, which is a very, very hard struggle, particularly now with the crisis in Ukraine as well as in Iraq. So I think it overshadows German politics, obviously, over all the decades, and it's still a vivid discussion about how we should react and how should we participate as a nation in conflict situations around the world.
Right, okay. Let's go to Dmitry Babic in Moscow. Dmitry, when we listen to the story of how the Allies prevailed and won World War II, we hear most about the US role, we hear a lot about the British role, but Russia played a massive role in this victory in the Second World War. What can you tell us about the Russian role?
Well, first I would like to agree with Professor Kuznick that the war was avoidable. And I think it's a huge lesson for the whole world that before 1941, almost all the major countries in Europe and even in the United States cooperated, or at least did something with Hitler, unfortunately, including the Soviet Union, which in 1939 signed this so-called non-aggression pact, which was condemned already in the times of Gorbachev, and Russia continues to condemn it. So I think it's a huge lesson that at a certain point every country thought that it could do some business with Hitler, improve its situation. You know, like Poles thought that they could take part of Czechoslovakia, where the Polish minority lived. Even Belgians, you know, who are supposed to be the nicest people in Europe, even they, when France wanted to protect Czechoslovakia and asked them for the right to move the French borders, the French troops closer to the German border, you know, the Belgians refused back in 1938. Coming back to your question about the price that Russia had to pay, the price was huge, 27 million people. And it's very uncomfortable for us to know that many people around the world have forgotten this. I can tell you a story which is very dear to my heart. When I studied in the United States in 1991, our professor at the history class asked the students, including me, gentlemen, do you know how many Jews were exterminated during the Second World War? And most of the students responded correctly, 6 to 7 million. And then he asked, do you know how many Russians died in this war? And only I could answer that there were 27 million Russians who died in this war. At least half of them, probably more, civilians.
Okay.
So this is a huge wound which still aches in Russia.
Okay, Professor Kuznick, you want to respond to that? Yeah.
Dimitri's absolutely right about that, especially in the United States. There is such ignorance about World War II, it's shocking. I just last week asked my undergraduates, I asked them several questions about how many Americans died in Vietnam, how many Vietnamese died in that war. I also asked them about World War II. And I asked how many Americans died in World War II. These are college undergraduates, intelligent kids. And how many Soviets died in World War II. The answer, the median answer for both was 90 to 100,000. So the American students thought that approximately, the average was about 100,000 Soviets died in World War II. I told them they were off, they were only about 27 million off the right count on that. The Americans don't learn their history. One of the points that Mark was making, I think, is also very important, that Germany has grappled with the significance of World War II and its earlier history in a way that very few countries have. The Americans have not done that with Vietnam. Most Americans still think Vietnam is noble, and the Americans have not done it with other things in their history. But Germany, unlike Japan, has really been exemplary in honestly confronting these important parts of its past.
So you're saying the German recovery was a lot better than Japan's? Because, you know, Japan was also called, you know, the miracle recovery after World
No,
War
I'm not
II.
talking about German recovery. I'm talking about Germany grappling with the implications of its history, actually studying it.
Right.
The Abe administration in Japan is committed to whitewashing its history again, with wanting to revise the textbooks, do away with discussion of the Nanjing massacre, the Korean comfort women. I mean, but Germany has a very different history, and I often hold Germany up as the example of a country that has honestly confronted its history.
Yeah, let me ask Mark about that. Mark, it seemed like Germany had a focus on recovery. It recovered from World War II, I mean, after all that destruction and devastation, and became, as you pointed out earlier on, one of the economic powerhouses in the world today.
Yes, I mean, first of all, let me point out we dealt with it in a way that probably no other country has done so, but it was a crime that is uncomparable to all the other crimes on humanity as well. So it was a rightful decision, and I think there was some kind of, I think we were very aware of it, and we dealt with it until, I mean, I must tell, I'm born in '68, and my generation was proud not to be a German, but was proud not to be proud to be a German. It was a very deep feeling where I think we grew up with this feeling, and I think everybody got back to work, and the German Wirtschaftswunder under Erhard. I think everybody tried to work hard, and I think that was the fundament of the economic recovery. But also, I mean, you don't have to. I mean, you don't have to forget about, for example, the difficulties we had to accept Berlin as the capital after the reunification as the seat of the government. I mean, half of the population didn't want that because it was still ingrained in the German education that we don't have to be a proud and powerful nation. So many people were against moving the government to Berlin. And again, as I said, we have this, we're still very ambivalent about our role in the world nowadays.
Right, Dmitry, when we look at the Russian role again in World War II, you know, as you pointed out, the huge cost that Russia paid, 27 million people. And I'm just wondering, you know, with the Allies in the West have won this war, had it not been for the victory in the East?
Well, certainly the victory would not have been possible, or at least Europe would have changed beyond recognition if Russia did not confront Hitler's Germany. Well, I should be more precise, not Russia, but all of the Soviet Union, which included at the time Ukraine, you know, the Central Asian republics, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. You know, right now, I must tell you about two painful things for Russians, and this may start a discussion because until now we sort of agreed with each other, which is very pleasant. You know, the first painful moment is that a lot of journalists abroad now say that Hitler was as bad as Stalin, or Stalin was as bad as Hitler. Very few people in Russia deny that Stalin was a terrible villain, but certainly there is huge difference because after the Soviet Union took hold of Eastern Europe, despite the fact that it was a dictatorship and that certainly it was no bed of roses for all the nations that lived in places like Poland or the Baltics or Czechoslovakia, still, you know, most of these nations, in fact, all of them survived, and now they're developing in the framework of the European Union, many of them. If Hitler had been victorious and if the Soviet Union had not confronted him, certainly there would be no Jews in Europe, and several other nations, including most likely Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Gypsies, also maybe Lithuanians, all of these nations would have been removed or just exterminated.
Okay.
This is the terrible truth. And the other painful moment for us is that a lot of groups which cooperated with Hitler in Western Ukraine, in Latvia, and in Estonia, now their, I would say, political descendants are in power in these countries. And unfortunately, the European Union seems to forget the political history of these parties and gives them unconditional support whenever they quarrel with Russia.
Right, especially...
So these are two things which Russians right now find most painful.
Okay, especially when we look at current events right now, Professor.
I'm sorry to disappoint Dmitry, but actually I don't disagree with him about that. We're not going to have an argument about this. And it gets back in the United States now with its aggressive policies toward Russia. Again, no understanding of the history. When I ask my students who won the war in Europe during World War II, they say the United States. When I tell them that throughout most of the war, the Americans and the British confronted 10 German divisions combined, while the Russians themselves, the Soviets themselves, were confronting 200 German divisions, they're shocked. As Churchill himself says, it was the Russians who tore the guts out of the German war machine. It wasn't the United States. The United States contributed in a significant way. But the narrative for the Americans starts with D-Day. That's when the war starts for the Americans. Okay, we finally land. We had publicly promised to open up the second front before the end of 1942. So much of that Soviet death and destruction would not have occurred. John Kennedy says that it was as if the entire United States east of Chicago had been destroyed, what the Soviets suffered. We don't open up the second front for another year and a half after we promised we were going to, largely because of Churchill.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Professor Peter Kuznick, Mark Hewer, and Dmitry Babic, thanks to all of you for joining us.